Our next expert witness is David Chandler. David Chandler is a graduate of Harvey Mudd College, receiving his degree in physics, his undergraduate degree in physics. He has an MA in education from Claremont Graduate University and an MS in mathematics from California Polytechnic State University, Pomona. By profession, a physics teacher, David Chandler has published lucid online expositions of the physical principles observable in the destruction of the World Trade Center. His article, WTC 7, NIST Admits Free Fall, focuses on significant errors and discrepancies in the final National Institute of Standards and Technology report on the collapse of World Trade Center Tower 7, and includes excerpts from the technical briefing held by NIST on August 26, 2008, during which he put questions to the panel. Mr. Chandler's interventions resulted in NIST's acknowledgement that for more than 2 seconds of its collapse, World Trade Center 7 was in free fall acceleration, an admission which effectively contradicts NIST's explanation of the event. The title of David Chandler's testimony this morning is WTC 7 and the Case for Free Fall, a refutation of the official account. David Chandler.
Graham's a hard act to follow. I will mention that my wife said, "Tell Graham I love him." But he said, "Why can't you talk like him?" So anyway, he has a very pleasant voice, and it's appreciated. Anyway, so I will proceed in my own style. Okay. I'm actually going to read this. It's the only chance I have of getting this under 2 hours. So there we go. Okay. I've done research on the dynamics of the fall of both WTC 7 and WTC 1 primarily. I've been asked to speak about WTC 7, but when it comes time for questions, I'd be willing to take questions about either. So if some of you know my other work, I'll take questions there too. A 12th century Indian mathematician named Bhaskara put forward what has to be history's most concise proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He drew this diagram. It's a common tiling pattern. In this pattern, he could see a square built on the hypotenuse of a right triangle. Let's see, right there. But he could also see the same area in two squares built on the legs of the same right triangle. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and it's there. The truth of this statement is accessible to direct perception. His proof was a single word: behold. When I see Building 7 come down, my gut level response is simply to say, behold. If you watch it happen, there is really no question. It's a classic demolition. All support has been removed and the building falls straight down. We've seen it many times, always and only as a result of demolition. I read a critique of one of Richard Gage's talks a while back. The author of the critique thought the program dragged on far too long. His comment was that Richard could simply have shown Building 7 come down and stopped right there. He knew it was a controlled demolition. As soon as he saw it, he knew it was a controlled demolition. And if WTC 7 was a controlled demolition, he knew the whole 9/11 event was staged. This is Danny Joenko. Danny Joenko, a building demolition expert in Holland, was shown Building 7 for the first time during a live interview. His response: "This is a controlled demolition, no question about it. They simply blew up columns and the rest caved in afterwards." "You sure?" "Absolutely. It's been imploded. This was a hired job performed by a team of experts." And ... It's without a doubt a professional job. They knew exactly what they're doing. Only later did he learn that this building came down on 9/11. As a side note, I only recently learned that Danny Joenko died in a car crash this summer. So we've lost a significant voice. NIST wants us to discount our perceptions and our common sense and believe only them. However, we cannot overlook the fact that the NIST report was produced by a government agency in an administration that was notorious for censoring scientific reports for political purposes. The claim that an event resembling controlled demolition was caused by office fires is patently absurd. The analysis leading to this conclusion was based on computer models while discounting contradictory physical evidence. The computer model has not been made public. The report has not been peer-reviewed. Before NIST even began its study, the crime scene had been destroyed. NIST refused to search for residue of explosives. As our colleague Frank Legg has put it, quote, "The evidence for explosives in controlled demolition of all three buildings is both compelling and obvious. Hence, the failure of NIST to consider this possibility is prima facie evidence of corruption." Common sense is not a perfect guide to truth, but neither is blind faith in authority figures. Our senses can be fooled, but authority figures can lie. The correct response, the liberating response, when something does not pass the smell test, is to honor our good sense by validating it with honest observation, experimentation, and analysis. In other words, with science. As individuals, some of us may not have the talents or resources to validate our own perceptions about 9/11. But as a community, we do. Our role as the scientific core of the 9/11 truth movement is to engage with the evidence, to engage with the public, and to witness to the truth. In so doing, we let the people know they are not delusional. Sorry. That was, thought I'd edited that out. That was, by the way, a piece of steel recovered from WTC 7, and this says they have no steel from WTC 7. Oh well. This is a profile of the World Trade Center Building 7. It was a tall trapezoidal-shaped building. It's situated a little more than 100 meters north of the North Tower across Vesey Street. It's 47 stories, or 174 meters, or 571 feet tall. Its footprint is basically the size of an American football field. I believe Canadian football fields are a little different. It has 58 perimeter columns and 25 core columns, and it was a massive building. The 23rd floor housed a specially reinforced bunker for the New York City Office of Emergency Management. The tenants of the building in 2001 included Solomon Smith Barney, the IRS Regional Counsel, the U.S. Secret Service, the DOD, CIA, New York City Office of Emergency Management, Security Exchange Commission, and several banks and insurance companies. Needless to say, it was a very security-minded place. On the morning of 9/11, WTC 7 was hit by debris from the collapse of the North Tower. Much is made of this. But whereas the Twin Towers were hit by Boeing 767s flying at over 500 miles an hour, the few large projectiles that hit WTC-7 were more like mid-sized trucks, and the fastest of them that I measured were traveling at about 78 miles per hour. That's highway speed. The planes that hit the Twin Towers had about 1,500 times the kinetic energy of the fastest moving debris that hit WTC-7. Ultimately, NIST discounted the debris damage as a factor in the collapse of the building, but many people in their common perception still think that's a major factor. There were fires on a limited number of floors that moved around the building, staying in any one place no more than 20 to 30 minutes, exhausting the fuel and moving on. NIST claims that the northeast corner of the 12th floor had intense, prolonged fires, which caused unprecedented thermal expansion in the beams overhead, pushing a girder off its seat. This failure, they claim, cascaded down several floors, leaving column 79 unsupported and causing it to buckle. The failure of this single column, they say, is what ultimately brought down the building. Chris Sarnes, who's active with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, Chris Sarnes has analyzed the photographs showing the actual progression of fires as seen through the windows. And he discovered that the fires on the 12th floor in the northeast corner of the building had burned out over an hour earlier and moved on. So there's no fuel left where NIST had their column failure, supposedly. NIST needed fires around column 79 for their theory to work, and so they simply falsified the data. By the way, this is Chris Sarnes' analysis over here based on photographic evidence through the windows, and over here is NIST's model, and the bottom left corner there is the northeast corner, and around column 79 was the critical area. And so you can see at 2 p.m. and at 3 p.m. and at 4 p.m. And by then, the fire had already burned well past that corner of the 12th floor. Of course, NIST has somehow a hot spot right around column 79 when needed. And the evidence doesn't support that. Throughout the day, there were sounds of explosions and reports that WTC-7 was going to come down.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard.
You want to call your mother or something?
I didn't know it was the 7 World Trade Center, but I know it now coming back. A 4-block radius has been cordoned off because fire officials expect that building to collapse.
That kind of report was going on all afternoon. There's another one with Ashley Banfield, the previous woman here, also saying, see that building? That's the one I've been told numerous times is the one that's coming down next. So, BBC News famously jumped the gun and reported the collapse of WTC-7 in detail about 20 minutes prior to its actual occurrence. Other reporters who apparently knew the New York skyline better seemed to have had the same script, but showed confusion when they were reading what they were reading did not match what they were seeing.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time.
So he identifies when he's saying these things, and it's 4:15. The building came down at 5:20. The final demise of the building started with a bang. Can you hear it there? It's very subtle and it's hard to pick up on this sound system. Seconds prior to the penthouse collapsing, there's a very low frequency boom, and it's very, when you do a graphical analysis of the wave patterns, it's a very sharp onset. So it's like a boom. It's not like boom or something like that. It's very a clear, sharp percussion. And it's hard to hear there. And I'm realizing this is an earlier version of my slideshow, so the synchronicity here may have problems somewhere down the line, and we'll see, hopefully. There we go. We'll roll with the punches here, all right? For several more seconds, the building just stood there. Then the west penthouse, the other one on the right side over here, started to fall into the building. However, before it disappeared, the rest of the building cut loose and fell along with it. In my teaching, I use a video frame tracking program called Tracker as a data gathering tool. Okay. Here's an example of how it works. A student took a video of me dropping a soccer ball from a ladder. I imported the video into Tracker, then marked the position of the ball in each frame. Tracker captures the position and time data from which it can compute velocity and acceleration and graph anything versus anything else, basically. This is a graph of velocity versus time for that soccer ball as it's dropped. And notice that the slope, this basically is a linear graph when you take velocity versus time when there's a constant acceleration. Okay? So note here the slope is nearly constant at about 9.8 meters per second squared, and the number is shown right in here. It's 9.78 is what it's giving. But notice how linear it is. Notice how in the end it deviates from a straight line, because as the speed builds up, the drag increases, and so you're actually getting a little bit of a noticeable effect due to air resistance, even just from a ball dropping a few meters like that. Okay? So air resistance, as subtle a force as it is detectable. Okay? Okay, this is a graph for the roof line of WTC 7. Here it is, or excuse me. Note that for well over 2 seconds, the graph is linear, so the acceleration, similar to the soccer ball, the acceleration is constant. The slope of the linear portion of the graph is essentially equal to the acceleration of gravity within the margin of error of the measurements. In other words, for this building, even though it is falling straight down through its own supporting structure, free fall actually happened. Notice also that there's a sharp onset of free fall. It just turns a corner up there. The building is holding steady, then it simply lets go. In the approximately 2.5 seconds of free fall, it falls over 100 feet, the equivalent of about 8 stories. Free fall is motion under the influence of gravity alone. All resistance must be removed. Some people argue that the resistance in the case of WTC 7 was not significant because the falling mass was so great. It's true the falling mass was great, but the strength of the supporting structure was even greater. The structure was built to support 3 to 5 times the actual load. Look again at the velocity versus time graph, and notice when it does eventually engage the structure, the rate of acceleration slows, then actually decelerates. It's down here. So here it's a lesser downward acceleration, and it literally turns around at the very end. This is just as it's disappearing. But as it turns around, it's literally decelerating. And that's what you'd expect when you actually have engagement between the falling mass and the structure. And since NIST is claiming this, we're extending my talk here, I'm leaving my notes. As NIST is basically saying that the top part is crushing the structure, it should have been looking like that all along. The building has the strength to decelerate this falling mass. It's just that it wasn't happening. Newton's laws are formulated in terms of forces, masses, and accelerations. Another parallel set of concepts are the conservation laws. I'm teaching a little physics today. The conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and conservation of angular momentum are primary ones there. To lift an object requires something we call work. And that amount of work is stored as potential energy as long as the height is maintained. When the object falls, the potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, the energy of motion during free fall. during free fall, all of the potential energy is converted into kinetic energy. But if any of the energy is used for other purposes along the way, such as crushing the concrete or deforming the steel or throwing things around, there will be less energy available to be transformed into kinetic energy. Okay? So I did a little simulation where I hope you noticed as it went through, as it had to do some work on something else, it slowed down the falling ball because some of that energy was getting siphoned off for other purposes. And you can measure the result as the kinetic energy of the falling ball is thereby reduced. In the case of WTC 7, all of the energy was transformed into kinetic energy. So therefore, the work needed to destroy the structure was not available. It had to come from some other source. The fact of free fall is literally proof of demolition. So the energy to do what the falling mass was supposedly doing could not have come from the falling mass. A mass in free fall can do no work. And if something was being destroyed, it's not being destroyed by the falling mass. It was destroyed to enable the mass to fall. Now let's look at the NIST report on WTC 7. The preface states, this is directly from their report, NIST is a non-regulatory agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. The purpose of the NIST investigations is to improve the safety and structural integrity of buildings in the United States, and the focus is on fact-finding. NIST does not have the statutory authority to make findings of fault or negligence by individuals or organizations. Further, no part of any report resulting from a NIST investigation into a building failure or from an investigation under the National Construction Safety Team Act may be used in any suit or action for damages arising out of any matter mentioned in such report. So it was not exact. In other words, this is a building safety investigation. This was not CSI. And for the benefit of anybody who doesn't watch American television, that's a crime scene investigation. It's a popular show. We should not be asking for a new investigation. We should be asking for a real investigation. The final draft of the NIST WTC 7 report for public comment was released in August 2008, and the final report was released in November 25, 2008. In both of these, NIST discusses the rate of fall of the building. My measurement tracking the roofline is a completely standard way to understand its motion. NIST, however, did not initially do this. What NIST did was measure the overall time between two data points, like starting and stopping a stopwatch. The ending point was when the roof line reached the level of the 29th floor. Their starting point was 5.4 seconds earlier, presumably when the downward motion of the roof line began. This they compared with free fall time, which they calculated to be 3.9 seconds. They therefore proclaimed that the time of fall was 40% longer than free fall time. This is a stunningly invalid and meaningless measurement. Anyone at NIST who had anything to do with this measurement had to know immediately that they were part of a cover-up. The only way to validly compare the motion of the building to the acceleration of gravity is to measure the acceleration of the building. The acceleration is found from the slope of the velocity versus time graph. So in order to find the acceleration, you have to actually know the velocity as a function of time. In other words, you need a lot of data points. You can't get a valid measurement of acceleration from 2 data points unless you know ahead of time that the acceleration over that interval is uniform. Nobody does it this way because you can't assume a priori that the acceleration in a given situation is going to be uniform. NIST would not do it this way in a legitimate project. They would do what I did. Okay, like I said, this is out of sequence. By the way, this formula is in the NIST report calculating free fall time as they discuss it, and this formula is not valid under the conditions in which it's used. It's valid only when there's uniform acceleration. Not only that, it's valid only when there's 0 initial velocity. So to get this formula to work, you have to identify the exact precise onset. Like if I'm going to drop a ball, it would be the exact moment of release, and then this would only apply if there was no deviation from uniform acceleration. But over the interval they used it, it was clearly not uniform acceleration. So it's fraudulent to even use this when you know what you're doing. And they are not incompetent. These are absolutely competent scientists and engineers. That's the graph I thought I was going to. What they did is the equivalent. This is a graph they later produced. I'll talk about it later. But see that purple line there? What their measurement on the initial round was the equivalent of taking the first data point and the last data point and drawing a straight line between them and saying this represents the motion. So that was their initial representation, literally, based on what they did. So as we'll look at the graph, the acceleration is far from uniform. It's simply not a valid way to measure what they say they're measuring. Yet this is the basis of their initial denial of free fall. For a high school student to do this kind of analysis on a lab, they'd get a low grade. For NIST to do this kind of analysis is fraudulent. NIST desperately wanted to claim that free fall did not occur because they knew that actual free fall would be a smoking gun for demolition. They also knew that free fall did occur because they're competent scientists and engineers. I'm positive the very first thing they did was measure it the way I did it. Then someone said, we've got a problem here. This is speculation, but this is pretty much what they would have done. So instead of a head-on comparison of the acceleration of the building to the acceleration of gravity, they focused on the completely meaningless notion of free fall time. That's a bizarre construct even, but you might not realize if it is. They said that the fall of the building took longer than free fall time, and to make even this work, they had to falsify their time measurement. Here's the 5.4 second interval they measured. I put a clock on the screen. There's the fall of the building. That's 5.4 seconds. Now here it is, backward in slow motion. And see if you can tell when the clock should have started to be a fair timing of the fall. That's when they started the clock. Would you want these guys timing the race of your kid on a track team? So, to describe their timing as the time of fall is clearly dishonest. The building retained its full height for a significant period of time after they started their clock. The supposed event they chose to start their clock is a point in the middle of an ongoing period of disruption of the building's structure, but it was well before the actual downward motion. Jeremy Hammond has taken a different approach to the question of NIST's timing. He communicated with me about over the last few months. He wrote a detailed article on which is available at the Foreign Policy Journal website. NIST measurements are based on a video taken from West Street near Harrison Street, which they label as camera 3. That's this picture here. The camera has an upward-looking view toward WTC 7. That video shows a kink that develops in the roofline prior to the fall of the building. So can you notice a bowing of the roofline here? It's actual, okay. He also determined by comparison with other videos that the kink is not a vertical dip. This is something Richard needs to revise in his talk. It's not a dip in the roofline. It's a horizontal fold. Okay? The simple proof of this is the fold is visible only from below. This is another view, by the way. Notice the kink there, but notice it's also looking up at the roofline. Now this one is looking from a camera at the same level as the roofline. And notice how level the roofline remains throughout the fall, as a matter of fact. The penthouse collapses into the building, but if you take the roofline itself, it remains level. You never do see a kink. So it's not something dipping downward at all. It's something folding. So the building is being deformed horizontally, but the point that they took, we'll get to that here. The videos where the line of sight is level with the roofline, such as the one I used to do my measurement, show that the roofline stays flat even as it falls. Since camera 3 has an upward angled line of sight, a horizontal fold is indistinguishable from a vertical kink. Therefore, by choosing a tracking point near the center of the roofline and an angle of sight that's looking up, NIST was maximizing the ambiguity of whether it's horizontal or vertical. It appears this is the basis of their claim that the downward motion of the roofline began 1.5 seconds before downward motion actually began. The scientists at NIST had access to many videos from different perspectives, including all of these. They had to be aware that the collapse of the building was a three-dimensional event and that their chosen video had a line of sight that introduced ambiguity into the measurement. In a sense, this ambiguity was the solution they were looking for. By playing dumb and conveniently misinterpreting the orientation of the fold, they got their extra seconds. As Jeremy states in the abstract of his paper, quote, NIST's chosen methodology for determining the point in time representing the onset of global collapse is not merely fallacious, but indicative of a willful and deliberate effort to deceive the public and obfuscate the implications of free fall through scientific fraud. And I concur. On August 26, 2008, NIST held a technical briefing conference, and I was able to ask a question. I cited the fact that a number of people had measured the motion of the building and had determined it was within a few percent of free fall. Yet the report claims it fell 40% slower than free fall. Then I asked, how can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside? Sunder's answer was that free fall happens when there is no structural resistance. Free fall would have taken 3.9 seconds, but their model showed it should have come down in 5.4 seconds. The 5.4 seconds of their model was reasonable because there was structural resistance. There was a series of failures that had to take place, and they were not all simultaneous. The question here was how the video evidence that free fall actually occurred can be set aside. Sunder's answer is that their model showed that free fall could not have occurred. That's his answer. Sunder is elevating their model above the direct evidence, and that is not science. Sunder's response typifies the entire investigation. What they did was they substituted a computer model, or several computer models, for the actual physical evidence. Taking the evidence out of the picture insulated them from having to go where the evidence leads, because they didn't like what they saw down that road. NIST model is based on the assumption that WTC 7 came down as a natural collapse due to fire, gravity, and buckling columns. Since their model could not produce a freefall collapse, and since the video evidence shows that freefall actually occurred, their model is wrong, and the assumptions behind their model are wrong. NIST does not acknowledge this or try to account for the discrepancy in any way. Shamsunder, in interviews, has touted the robustness, is his word, of modern modeling software, describing how entire airplanes are designed from start to finish using computer models. But this is an irrelevant distraction. We are not talking about designing a plane or designing a building. We're talking about a forensic investigation of how a particular building actually came down. If explosives were used, you will never discover them in a computer model. Even if the computer model can be made to collapse, it does not mean that's the way the building actually collapsed. Conclusions drawn from computer models can only reproduce what is implied by the assumptions that were programmed in. NIST could have made their model work if, at a mouse click, 8 floors of support in the model were suddenly removed. But that would require that the fall of Building 7 be interpreted as a demolition. NIST had no intention of going there. That would have involved culpability, and finding culpability was not part of their mandate. In the August draft of the public comment, the strategy was to cover up the fact of freefall. That strategy didn't work because we let them know that there were some of us out here who could actually measure these things for ourselves. It was not just me, by the way. Numerous people measured the freefall or near freefall in different ways, and numerous people submitted written requests for correction to NIST. In November, the final report changed strategies. This gets a bit complicated. First, they continued to assert that their earlier analysis was correct. You can find the same timing analysis in the final report as in the previous one. Okay. I've been told I don't have to rush so much. Okay. But then they added, So they included the original timing report, reaffirmed that it's good, and then they said they added this more detailed analysis, and that's the way they described it. And so they did this from frame tracking measurements, the same as I did, all right? Except they're using a point on the center of the roof line instead of the corner. One difference between their data and mine is I tracked a corner of the building, whereas they tracked a point near the middle of the roof line. They said they were still using camera 3 video, so they still had the issue of the ambiguous lateral motion, which made it look as though the downward motion begins sooner and undergoes a more gradual transition into freefall. Notice how sharp the turning of the corner was in the graph that I did. Notice how it's sort of round. This one's upside down, by the way. Don't be confused by that. There's no problem there. So over here is the vertical position on this graph indicates downward velocity. So it's, okay. But notice how they round into what they call stage 2 here. And that's, I believe, still an artifact of the fact that they're using that camera 3 angle. Let's see. Okay, so they use the camera 3 video. Then they put their graph in a box, which they divided into 3 stages. The real fall of the building starts in stage 2 and continues in stage 3. However, they tack on the erroneous early measurements as stage 1. They put a smooth curve through the data, which has absolutely no physical significance, except to spin their results to look like a single smooth continuous process. The overall time for their 3 stages is, as you guessed it, 5.4 seconds. But they did one more thing. Amazingly, someone at NIST added a nice straight red regression line through their stage 2 data. See that line there? They even gave the equation of the line right here. If you can read that, it shows that the slope is exactly equal to the acceleration of gravity. So that red line is a flat-out absolute admission of they're even closer to the acceleration of gravity than my measurement. They were right smack on the money. They're on that number for this accepted as acceleration of gravity in feet units, okay, 32.196 over here. And so their graph shows that WTC7 fell in absolute free fall for over 2 seconds. They're about 2.25 seconds. I got 2.5 seconds. They used a different point than I did. Whether or not the whole process took 5.4 seconds or any other amount of time is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how long the building creaked and groaned before getting ready to fall. As we have said before, the timing of the fall is irrelevant. Whether or not the smoothing curve was a good fit is irrelevant. What the exact start time of the fall was irrelevant. Okay? I'm losing my words here. The only thing that's relevant here is the slope of the graph. And the fact that the slope, it doesn't matter how it started, how gradually it started, or anything else. If the slope of that graph is the acceleration of gravity, it's in free fall. And it doesn't matter what it did to get into free fall. It's in free fall. So everything else they're saying here is irrelevant. Free fall happened, and NIST admits it. At least someone at NIST agrees with enough clout to put this into their final report and make it stick. I'm appealing to the guys at NIST. Somebody in there is wanting to come out of the closet, and that red line shows it. The red line on this graph means that NIST acknowledges WT7 came down without resistance and without doing any work for over 100 feet. It means all support for 8 stories was suddenly removed by something other than the falling mass. It literally means that NIST's final report confirms WTC7 had to have been a demolition. This should be the end of the story. This should be what's reported in headlines around the world. But it didn't happen that way. I can hear the political advisors at NIST now saying, don't worry about it. The American people don't know physics. Clutter up the graph, point at something else, and don't mention it again. And that's exactly what they did. NIST's 3 stages add up to 5.4 seconds. So in a weasel-worded conclusion, they claim their original analysis is vindicated. It says, as noted above, the collapse time was approximately 40% longer than that of free fall for the first 18 stories of descent. The detailed analysis shows that this increase in time is primarily due to stage 1, which was fabricated. The 3 stages of collapse progression described above are consistent with the results of the global collapse analysis discussed in Chapter 12 of NIST NC Star 1-9. Their concluding statement is not actually saying free fall is consistent with their collapse analysis. There is nothing in their analysis that justifies a period of free fall. They're saying the overall 5.4 seconds of the 3 stages taken together is consistent with their analysis. And some friends of mine have pointed out in the original document, they said that their analysis is consistent with physical principles. They took that out and they put this statement in its place. So now they're not even claiming that it's consistent with physical principles. All references to that phrase were taken out. So we're back to their 2 data points connected with a straight line. They simply ignore the very real period of free fall and point instead to their artificial 5.4 second construct and then walk away from it. In interviews and other appearances, Shyam Sundar has attempted to minimize the significance of free fall observation by discounting the visible collapse as seen in videos. He claims that the interior had already collapsed, and what we are seeing is just the facade of the building. Note, by the way, that what Sundar is calling a facade is actually a bearing wall. Of course, we're seeing only the surface. But what can be seen on the surface contains evidence about what lies behind. If there were an internal collapse ahead of time, the falling beams and girders would apply torques to the exterior walls, which would have created visible distortions. If the collapse could propagate the length of the building, why couldn't it propagate to the much closer exterior walls of the building and therefore become visible? The structure is rigid right up until a fraction of a second before it begins to fall. Then there is a clear transition point where the structure literally goes limp. This occurs suddenly, just as it starts to fall. Another point, the windows under the east penthouse broke when the east penthouse fell into the building, but no more window breakage occurs until after the building began to fall. Had the bulk of the interior collapsed ahead of time, as NIST claims, we would have seen the same external signs of window breakage that we saw in the smaller, earlier internal collapse. The west penthouse, another point, the west penthouse is fully supported by interior columns right up to a half second before the total collapse. When the west penthouse does collapse, it falls only about half its height before the rest of the building joins it in freefall. It remains partially visible throughout the freefall interval. When the building falls, there are roiling clouds of debris that race down the street, frequently likened to the volcanic pyroclastic flow. The release of these debris-laden clouds is simultaneous with the visible collapse. Had the bulk of the building collapsed earlier, with just a visible facade falling at the end, the debris cloud would have occurred earlier. Remember, the context of this separation of interior and exterior collapse is that Sunder is trying to justify the observation of freefall. He's claiming the real collapse occurred as their model predicted, slower than freefall. What we can see from the exterior is merely a thin shell, so supposedly its freefall is inconsequential. As suggested above, this whole construct is false. However, if only the north wall remained, or north and west wall as we see here, and notice that the attachment to the south wall on the right over here is still intact, so pretty much all the walls remain, but they claim only the north wall remained. Let's play along with that. If only the facade remained, the exterior columns would have their full strength, but without the load. They would be expected to remain perhaps for many seconds, swaying and tipping and buckling one by one, as we saw for the straggler columns in the North Tower. The simultaneous straight-down freefall of a postulated thin veneer wall would be even more mysterious than the freefall of a loaded structure. All this is fantasy, however. What we saw was the actual building falling nearly simultaneously with the west penthouse, with accompanying window breakage, with simultaneous release of massive debris clouds. NIST has no escape from freefall. The building as a whole entered freefall for a significant period of time over a significant distance. This requires the sudden removal of support, and that requires explosives. The NIST WTC-7 report has never been peer-reviewed. There has been no forum for critiquing or correcting the final report. This does not constitute science. It is instead an authoritarian declaration by a government agency that demonstrated repeatedly its unwillingness to consider the one hypothesis that could actually account for their observations. The fact that NIST attempted to deny the obvious freefall, then the fact that they attempted to hide their acknowledgement of freefall, is a transparently false construct. Together with the fact that they used an inappropriate camera angle, inappropriate analytical methodology, all of this points to NIST's role in furthering a criminal cover-up. To sum up, the most significant fact in all of this is that we have measured, and NIST has reluctantly confirmed, that WTC-7 went through a significant period of freefall. Dynamically, this means all column support was suddenly and simultaneously eliminated. Practically, this means there was an intentional demolition, and that it had to have been planned and set up in advance. Politically and sociologically, it means, given the extreme security consciousness of the agencies that occupied the building, the only way the building could be prepared for demolition would be through deep insider connections. Ultimately, this means that insiders who were involved in the planning and executing and demolition of WTC 7 for the day of 9/11 had to be in coordination with the entire event of 9/11. The other building demolitions, the airplane hijackings, the cover-up, all of it. There was another slide, apparently. Anyway, I was going to say, behold. I don't know what happened to my slideshow, but anyway, we're not delusional. We are, in fact, witnessing a planned intentional building demolition. The fact that NIST could not come up with an alternative model that actually works is a pretty clear indication that no alternative explanation exists.
Behold, David Chandler. Thank you. We will take questions from panelists at this time. Professor Johnson.
Thank you so much. A very interesting presentation. Representing the community of scientists, both in Canada and North America, I assume that we can think of science, the science community, as an independent group dedicated to finding truth. Where do we go next with these very persuasive equations that you have come up with, and what kind of test or what entity can we take this to be peer reviewed? National Academy of Sciences? And doesn't the community of scientists have something at stake here?
I went to the American Association of Physics Teachers conference about a year ago up in Portland and presented a paper on this topic. I mean, a very much abbreviated version of some of this. And I did a poster session also, in which basically people could wander by over a period of about 2 hours and we chat about it. And I had probably about 100, I had handouts that people took, so I know about 100 people came by the poster session. And the vast majority, when I would point to Building 7 and say, have you heard about the fact there was a third building in New York that came down? And they would say no. So these are my peer group as far as high school and college teachers. So it's the teaching community of the physics community. And they're more intelligent than the average layman, I would assume. And they're, most of them, pretty well informed about current events. Most of them get their information and news from the mainstream media. And by and large, they had never seen Building 7 come down. And they had never really thought it through. They did have an attitude. They came in sort of with rolling their eyes, snickering, things like that. But in this particular group, as I was able to, those for whom I was able to get their attention long enough to run them through a couple of the little graphs I did, they latched onto it, and some of them stood there for a long time, some went away and brought their friends and came back. And it was like a revelation to these people who had, yes, they might be qualified, but they haven't been exposed to the facts. And I think this is one of the sociological elements of all of this, is the science community, just like the rest of the population, is beholden to the, I mean, they're basically being manipulated by the media, which is being manipulated by who knows who behind the media, but it's being very effectively squelched. And so, I mean, how do you do it? I guess it's a struggle. I mean, why am I here? I'm talking to people who will listen, and hopefully the proceedings from this conference will be given to people who maybe will listen because of that. I mean, I put out stuff on YouTube. Why do I put it on YouTube rather than in some scientific journal? Well, it's been viewed by tens of thousands of people there. That's why. And so it's a political struggle on a certain level. It's not candidates and elections, but political. But it's sort of vying for the thinking, the minds of the population. So I don't know. That's the bottom line.
Yes, Professor Jenkins.
Mr. Chandler, I need your help. In my working career, I have rubbed shoulders for many years with physical scientists and engineers, but unfortunately, none of it rubbed into my brain. I'm a layman with respect to these issues. I ran across an article, which I know you are aware of, by Professor Bazant from Northwestern University. And my primitive understanding of this is that he claims that something approximating free fall does not deny the laws of physics. It has to do with energy balances between kinetic falling floors and the rest of the structure, the so-called crush down and crush up theory. And I would ask you, please, can you help us understand his line of thinking, and then can you show us very briefly why you think it's not right?
Okay, so this one, I'd have a paper, if you look in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, specifically about the North Tower building WTC 1, which is basically a specific refutation of Bazant's theory. Keep in mind, Bazant published this thing within days of 9/11, and it's essentially the theory that NIST relied on to justify not proceeding in their analysis past the initiation of collapse, because they simply asserted that once collapse began, it's all over. It was going to happen. And that was basically relying on Bazant's analysis that if it started, it would continue. It's completely fallacious. Bazant he's corrupt. I mean, he has to be. There's no way that you can have free fall without some other agency removing the support. So I flat out disagree with that, and I think a lot of other people flat out disagree with that. The analysis I gave for the North Tower, if you said you wanted an alternative analysis, think of a falling block, and it's crushing down this structure underneath it, okay? Now, if you measure the acceleration of the falling block, this is what I did in that paper I referred to. If you take this, I'm taking the same simplifications of my analysis as Bazant did. He talked about a block crushing this other block, no structure within it or anything like that. Okay, so taking his model, and you measure the acceleration downward of the roof line, and it turns out it's about 64% of the acceleration of gravity. It's not free fall. It's basically roughly 2/3 of free fall. Okay? Now, think about it. A little bit of physics here. Newton's second law says that the force equals mass times acceleration. Basically, the essence here is that the acceleration is going to be in the direction of the net force. If the net force is that way, that's the way you're going to accelerate, okay? Well, here's the block. What two forces are acting? Gravity downward, resistance upward from the structure, okay? And it's accelerating downward. So where must the net force be pointed? Downward. How do you get a downward net force when you have gravity versus resistance? Which must be greater? Gravity must be greater in order for the net force to be dominantly downward, right? Which is saying that the resistive force due to the structure was less than the gravitational force acting on the top block. Good. There's a name for that gravitational force acting on the top block, and that's its weight. Okay? Therefore, and the force that the structure is exerting on the top block, Newton's third law, says that that's equal to the force the top block applies to the structure, which is about 1/3 of the weight. So the falling block is applying a force to the lower structure that's approximately 1/3 of its weight. If it had simply been sitting there, it would apply its entire weight. So it is now supposedly crushing the lower structure with 1/3 as much force as the building is designed to hold in the first place. And in fact, the building is designed to hold 3 to 5 times that amount of weight. Therefore, to go from supporting 3 to 5 times that weight to not being able to support a third of the weight, it's approximately 90% of the resistive capacity of this structure has been eliminated. So you got the synopsis of my article. But, were you able to follow that a little bit?
I was a little bit.
Okay.
I'm ahead of where I started.
Thank you.
May I just have one more
Yes, sir.
question? You reach a conclusion which others have reached as well, and I'm particularly think that David Ray Griffin reached this conclusion, perhaps in the new Pearl Harbor book, that if you accept that Building 7 came down from controlled demolition, every part of the official account must be rejected, every part. There is no reasoning space, if you will, between the demolition of Building 7 and the destruction of the World Trade Towers. I'm a little hesitant to make that connection quite so in a conclusive way. And I'm hesitant because when we discuss the motives, possible motives for bringing down Building 7, they always have a different cast than the motives we use to discuss the destruction of the Twin Towers. And it seems to me that begins to open some space between these two events. We talk about the destruction of files. We talk about profit for Mr. Silverstein from his insurance policies. We do not talk about creating an enhanced Pearl Harbor effect. So I'd ask you, can you find any space, if you were really, really trying hard, between the accepting the controlled demolition of Building 7 and leaving something intact for the official account?
Okay. No. And the key element you've left out of this is that in order to bring down Building 7 in the kind of demolition we saw, it took preparation. And it could not have been prepared during office fires in the same building on the same day in that amount of time. It would have taken months. And therefore, if you have preparation, you have not only foreknowledge, but you had to coordinate. You had to know which day it was going to come down. You had to know everything. You had to coordinate with the flights. You had to coordinate with everything else that was happening. It might have been parceled out to different committees, and there might have been different motives for why should we take out Building 7 as well as these others. But the bottom line is that physically, how are you going to have this, by the way, this came down on the same day, without having it being related? I don't think there is any space in there. And that's the essence of my answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Judge Impazamato.
Thank you. Mr. Chandler, is it possible to establish which possible means may have been used to start the control of the demolition, bomb, fire, or the other means, chemical means, for example?
Okay. My analysis is, I was looking at what was up here. I was looking at video footage of the exterior of the building. I personally have not researched what's going on inside. Chris Sarnes did the fires, and Kevin Ryan has analyzed various elements of their theory of how it could have been initiated. Their theory of how it was initiated was a progressive collapse that had to have been, a slow progression of things, covered up by the fact that they're claiming it was an interior event, and that all we saw that makes it look simultaneous is the exterior, which I pretty much have shown why that's not a very good analysis. But no, I don't have, from my research, apart from this, it was a sudden onset. And if you keep in mind this building would occupy, it's like 100 meters side to side, and it's the width of an American football field. I mean, that's a huge footprint for this building. And to get the roof line to come down horizontally, as we saw, means all of the support across the entire width of the building had to have been eliminated within a fraction of a second, simultaneously over approximately 8 floors of vertical extent. And I can't find any plausible mechanism apart from use of explosives to do that. There are other demolition techniques like the Vernage demolitions they do in France and so forth, but those are much more complicated to set up and involves stripping away a lot of the support and using hydraulics to remove the support structure. That's not plausible in this context. So in this, given the context of 9/11, explosives is the only way I can even imagine that that was accomplished.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Professor Lee?
Thanks for a lucid presentation. I've got a couple of minor points and then hopefully something with more weight. Early in your talk, the videos of WTC 7 showed billowing smoke, and at times of the day when the fires were supposed to be out, have been extinguished in the building 7 itself. So what would be the source of these video images of billowing smoke?
Well, there were fires on various floors of the building. There was also the buildings across the street. Buildings 5 and 6 were under basically totally engulfed in fires.
Okay.
I'm not sure the status at that particular time, but some of the smoke was, I'm sure, coming from those. There's also like extra smoke right at the onset of collapse. I haven't done any analysis of that.
This was like an hour before.
Okay, but I'm saying at the onset of collapse, there were extra billows which could perhaps be associated with explosions there. But an hour before, like I said, there were fires going on the various floors.
Yes.
We're not denying that. There were definitely fires. It was not like the whole building was engulfed in flame. It was individual floors that were on fire and burning, and there was the additional fires across Vesey Street, buildings 5 and 6. So
right.
The combination, I'm sure, was the source.
Okay. Your figure shows building 7 collapsing, and you mentioned this figure several times in 5.4 seconds.
That was NIST's figure.
That was NIST's figure. And then Richard Gage uses a figure of 6.5 seconds. And so is there any way of accommodating, are you having different starting points? And could this be a wedge that could be driven into the accurate treatment of this building?
Okay. I've heard a number of estimates for the entire collapse time, 6 point something, 7 point something, somewhere in that range. I don't go there because we can't see it all the way to the ground. And so you have to sort of estimate how long would it have fallen all the way to the ground. What NIST is measuring is the part of the building visible above the roof lines of the foreground buildings on camera 3. When they saw that there's these two buildings and forming sort of a V-shaped opening, when the building came down to that point, that's the top of the windows on floor 29. So their timing was down to that level, and the fact that they got 5.4 seconds is accounted for by that they went to an early start point that was artificially conjured up, okay?
Okay.
And so the actual free fall time, which is, this is the way NIST is doing it, that's not a very valid way to measure this. You have to track it. And in the tracking of it, the significance is not how long it took to come down. The significance is the acceleration.
So I think you might not have sort of answered my question. Would you accept Richard Gage's 6.5 seconds?
Yeah, well, the timings all the way to the ground, I just say, yeah. I don't even go there. I think they're approximately correct. I don't think they're a very reliable number, but I don't think it's terribly off. And it's somewhere in that ballpark, but I just ignored it because it's like, that's not meaningful. It might communicate with the general public, so leave it in, I don't care. But the part that's needed is to measure the motion of the building, and that's why I focused on that.
One
yeah,
more?
Yes.
This next question is rhetorical, but I think important. Obviously, official government agencies have described in great detail the way the buildings collapsed. And so obviously, these are important documents that would have required radical changes in building codes for tall buildings. So obviously, there must be some, total rewriting of the building codes for the 50 or 100 or 200 high-rise buildings that have been built since September 2001. Can someone describe those radical changes in building codes?
That sounds like the kind of, I'm just guessing at this, that sounds like the kind of question Kevin Ryan would take, so ask him. But I mean, when the time comes, he'll be on sooner or later, but
okay.
I don't go there.
Can I put it to, I'll put it to Kevin later in the afternoon. Okay, thanks.
Professor Johnson.
Yes. A lot of the case made by NIST is dependent on the model that they have constructed. They have not released that model. My tax dollars have gone to pay for that model, and I would like to have the benefit of learning from that model. So that's one question. Is there any hope that we can pry that modeling loose from NIST so that we can all benefit from their expertise? And also, I wonder if how hard it would be to construct an alternative model that would actually incorporate the notion of the severing of the columns at the base.
I don't know. I mean, doing a computer model like that, it's a big project just in itself, and but there are people who do. You're shaking your head. I know that there are guys that do finite element modeling and that type of thing, and so yes, it could be done. But I mean, if you basically try to duplicate their model, the essence of their model are the assumptions they built into it. And they had to really work at it to get their model to even collapse. And they had to make all kinds of stretched assumptions to even make that happen even in their own model. And we know that from the little bits and pieces that they talk about. But they know they haven't released the model, and yes, it is our American tax dollars that went there. I have to keep in mind this is not America, this is Canada. Okay, but yes, so hey, I'd be very interested in them doing that. But for them to release the model is basically throwing in the towel for them, because I'm confident that their model will show what a shamble it is. And for that to happen, you have to politically get to them to where there's somebody willing to admit that they committed fraud.
Professor Lee?
At the very end of your presentation, you mentioned, almost in passing, the political and sociological aspects of the case. And you certainly have presented extremely cogent and compelling evidence for the physical collapse of the building. But I'm going to put this out as a question that perhaps could be directed more generally to you and others in this field. Could one of the reasons for bringing down Building 7 be that the controlled demolition of Buildings 1 and 2 was operated out of the City Emergency Response Center on the 23rd floor of Building 7?
Well, that's obviously, that's a theory that was put out early on, and it's speculative, and I think it makes, it very well could have been. I don't see that that's even a necessary place to go to understand it, but yes, it seems plausible. But there's a lot of other reasons to take down Building 7. And one of the things I've noticed about motivations for the whole 9/11 thing, it was not done for one reason. It was done for a whole bunch of reasons, so there's a whole bunch of people benefiting in different ways from this event. And it was sort of the mutual overlapping interests that helped to put the project together. There was obviously the the desire, I mean, in my mind it's obvious, there was a desire to create a, New Pearl Harbor, as people have said, create a pretext for war with massive casualties that would justify a major change in policy and so forth. But there was financial motivations for corporations, there were personal financial motivations for the owner of the building. There was some other talk that was given that was lots about all these different, yesterday, about who's benefiting and so forth. Lots of people benefited in lots of ways. And part of the reason I think a lot of the corporate people are not speaking up is they're having ongoing, they need to keep the flow of money coming from the government, and so they're not going to rock the boat. And why does the media not do it? Well, they want access to government officials, so they're not going to rock the boat. So there's all kinds of people conspiring on different levels to just make the story go away.
Other questions? All right. Thank you, David Chandler.